Hey, welcome to the Sea Butters channel again. We are taking a look at another Surface, this time the Surface Go. And I have kind of avoided this one because I didn't think it was worth looking at, but curiosity got the better of me, and I'll do a video on my comparison of the Surface Go with the Surface Pro. But I'm actually I'm really happy with the form factor to say the least, but this video we're going to talk about the throttling characteristics, because this is basically a little microcosm of all the things we've seen in past Surface devices. So the first thing I want to point out is one of the things that I've kind of researched with these surfaces is looking at the TDP usage. So I have heat soaked this device and wanted to see what performance looked like in this device when it's completely heat soaked. So this is running a benchmark, and you can see it's kind of totally ramped down as far as it's going to go from a heat perspective. And what we see is it bounces around between 4.1 watts to about 5 watts in this scenario. And while it was heat soaked, I ran this benchmark and we see an average of 20.2. Now that's like worst case scenario, you're completely heat soaked. I ran the benchmark. So how that compares to the Surface Pro is we see the Surface Pro 5 kind of can idle around 11-ish, 12. It bounces between 11 and 13 depending on ambient temps. And the Surface Pro 6 can hold about 16 watts. Now watts is a really good measure of what your performance is going to be. Watts used equals calculations done, and that's shared between the CPU and the GPU. Now what we're seeing with the Surface Go is the standard CPU speed is 1.6 gigahertz, but when it's heat soaked like this, it kind of bounces between as low as 600 to 800 megahertz, and the GPU itself bounces around between as low as 400 to, it's actually hitting 600 there, but that's where usually it's in between 400 and 550. And they kind of trade blows. Now, originally, I thought, I thought that, there's no turbo on this machine. It only goes up to 1.6 gigahertz. So I didn't think that there would be much like peak performance to try to take advantage of. I figured it would just, that low, it's probably not using much power anyways, but it really is limited, and the clocks are getting pulled down because of heat. And so your sustained gaming performance on a Surface Go is more limited than a Surface Pro. But that said, and I wish I hadn't I wish I hadn't started at the low end here, because watch what happens when I take the infamous fan and drop it on this device. We'll let that kind of cool down the chassis. Now you're not going to be able to see the fan, but this is just a USB fan, just my standard Arctic Breeze USB fan. Probably a link in the description, but I'm just letting it cool down the back of the Surface. And you're already starting to see the watts creep up. So it's at 5.2 and from as low as 4.1. So anyways, while that's cooling down the chassis of this device that's been heat soaked, I just wanted to talk about performance in general. Now the chip in here, it's Pentium 441YU, I believe, and they call that a Pentium, but let's be real, folks. Here, it's a Kaby Lake. Now that's the same architecture that's in the Surface Pro 6. And it's gimped by the processor speed, where in the Surface Pro you might see a peak as high as 4 gigahertz or so. They've limited it to 1.6 on this machine, so you don't see a lot of burst happening, which can make the device feel a little laggy. Like, people have complained about the processor on this machine And I think the majority of those issues is because it doesn't spike and get you some of that really snappy performance when you're web browsing or things. Sometimes you see just little micro delays and things, and that's because it doesn't have a turbo boost in effect. So, but that said, the architecture is super sound on this device. This isn't an Atom. This isn't anything else. And if you get the 8 GB version with the 128 gigabyte SSD, it's an NVMe. It's fairly quick. In fact, I've been very impressed with the speed of it in general. So that said, you if you try to use this device heavily, it does bog down on you. We saw it went down to as low as 4.1 watts. But as this fan is cooling things off, we're already up to 7 watts. So that's a major improvement. So once this, well, it kind of takes a while for it to adjust and cool down with this fan on it. So maybe I'll keep talking for a little bit about what I've experienced. But if you start this with a cold device, you can actually see that it's got Intel HD graphics 615 versus the 620 in the Surface Pro 6. And to tell you the truth, when this device is fresh, it's fairly quick. It's competitive with the Surface Pro 6 initially, but then it bogs down super quick. So it's kind of a trade-off. But anyways, we'll see this eventually get up as high as 8+ watts. And it does seem to take longer than the Surface Pro to let that maximum watt usage bump back up. So it takes a minute here. But let's look at our clock speeds where we're at right now. So we're pushing 7.5 watts, and this is our GPU. And I apologize. That's really hard to see, but I'll just talk you through it. The CPU is already at about 1 to 1.2 gigahertz with the fan on the back, and the GPU is up to 700 megahertz, and it's up to 7.8 watts here. So ideally, if we could find a way, if we can cool this down enough, we would see 1.6 gigahertz on the CPU and 800 on the GPU. We just hit 800 on the GPU. And that's what it maxes out at. HD Graphics 615 maxes out at 800 megahertz. So we're actually improving performance pretty substantially. In fact, if you take the 4.1 watts that it idles at, and once this cools down, you're looking at something like anywhere between 8 and 8.5, sometimes even 9 watts, you're looking at almost a 100% improvement in performance based on wattage. So that's pretty decent. So let's go ahead now that the fan's cooled things off a little bit. I've written down what this is doing stock. So when it's heat soaked, I've written down the performance numbers averaging 20.2 frames per second. So now that we're using the fan on the back, things are cooling down. It's peaking at 9 watts or so. Let's go ahead and rerun that benchmark and see how much improvement we gain in this particular game. So you can see we're sustaining about 9 watts here. And we're doing pretty good because our GPU has stayed consistently at 800 megahertz there, and our CPU is dropping a little out of the 1.6 range, but it's not doing too bad. So we're still sustaining right around that 8 watt mark. Okay, so there we go. So we've gained, our min went to 20, our max went to 30, and our average went to 25.5. So versus heat soaked, that gave us a decent boost. So if we take the 25.5 divided by our 20, whoops, okay, 25.5 divide by our 20 frames per second, we're getting about a 27% increase in performance by running that fan on the back. So we still have to play around with undervolting though, which I haven't done yet, but we could kind of try that on the fly and see if it's possible to let this benchmark run and have it sustain 800 GPU and 1.6 CPU, because then we know we're basically maxing the device out. So let's give it a shot. So if you haven't messed around with throttle stop, like I say, this is the first time I'm doing this, so hopefully it works. Sometimes it doesn't like certain CPU architectures, but let's see what happens. Okay, we're going to go into our TPL, our turbo power limits, and look, we've got a long power max of 8 watts. Now, that's pretty interesting because normally the Surface devices don't let you mess with this. It tends to just kind of ignore these values, I've noticed, but let's go ahead and give it a value of 12. And it's possible this is going to do nothing, but let's just give it a shot. We'll move it from 8 to 12 and see if that does anything for us on, wow. I don't know if that was legit or not, but we are pushing 9 watts now, and we've got 800 megahertz on the GPU and 1.5 to 1.6. So we're actually maxing this chip out now, and I don't know if that's just coincidence because I do have that fan on there. So that's kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and run another benchmark just to see if that did anything for us. So this really is looking pretty good because we're sustaining almost 9 watts, and our CPU gigahertz is at 1.55, between 1.44 to 1.55, and our GPU is locked at 800. So that's not too shabby. We're able to sustain those 9 watts pretty easily, and the temps are fine. 71 degrees Celsius is nothing to be worried about at all. And the device feels cool. Of course, I do have the fan on here. Keep that in mind. You maybe wouldn't want to push it this hard if it didn't have the fan on there, and it may clamp down the CPU in general. So we got a little boost, but nothing major. We got a little bit more max FPS by doing that. Let's try another trick where we try to undervolt this machine. I still am not sure if I actually was able to up the TDP by doing that. So anyways, now I'm in the Fiver control on throttle stop, and I just clicked unlocked adjustable voltage. Now, I don't know if this is going to take or not, because Surface tends to have some wonky BIOSes that do special things. But let's go ahead, and my voltage is, Let's see what the voltage goes to if I'm over here. It looks like it's, wow, this thing has really low voltage. It's peaking at 0.71 or so. But anyways, I'm going to use the offset voltage, and I'm just going to reduce it by a few millivolts. Maybe I'll drop it 10. And I'm not going to save the voltages, but I am going to apply them. And we do have a CPU core. Adjustment, and we saw that peaking at 0.71. It's still hitting 0.7122. Let's try dropping it a little more and see if it's actually doing anything. Okay, I haven't seen it hit 0.71 anymore, so it looks, tentatively, it looks like it's actually making a difference. Let's drop it a tiny bit more. Maybe I'll go for 25 and see. Looks like I haven't seen it hit that 0.71 right here. So I actually think this is working. So let's go ahead and see if that made a difference for us. So by undervolting it a little bit, we should be able to see it stay closer to 1.6. And we were already able to get the GPU stuck on that 800 megahertz. So we've got 8.7 watts, but it literally can't push any more watts than that because the CPU's maxed out and the GPU's maxed out at this point. But I still do see it fluctuating a little bit, but I think that may just be normal to see. I think it's completely maxed out. So let's run the benchmark again. So you can see the temp is gone down. It's in the 60s. It just hit 70. But the temperature's a little bit lower, which is good, which is probably due to the undervolt, obviously. But in general, it looks like we're able to, there goes a 9.2 watts. You guys see that for a second? We're able to fully unlock the capability of this machine. Although, okay, the second I say that, we see a result. It dropped to 750 for a second there, and the CPU has dipped to 1.1 megahertz. We'll have to see what it spits out. 25.3, so tiny gain. In the same vein as what it was before, but like I say, we're kind of pushing up against the limits here. Let me see if turning it on does anything for us. So yeah, it looks like with our usual tricks of undervolting and running this fan here, we're able to sustain some pretty decent gains. We're able to keep the CPU clock at about 1.6 and the GPU clock at around 800, which is completely maxing out this device. And in fact, if you look at the Surface Pro 6 video, in this game, and I wouldn't expect this for every game, but in this particular game, I think the average frames per second on the Surface Pro 6 was 26 frames per second stock. So the Surface Go is not too bad. Like, yes, it is a dual core with hyper threading, not a quad core, but it's basically the same chip. It's just a little bit slower. And obviously, if you don't do any of these tricks to undervolt it or keep it cool, you're going to hit a wall very quickly. You know, sustaining only 4.1 watts long term when you're not using any of these tricks, it's not going to have the best performance, but you can get about the performance of a fully heat saturated Surface Pro 5 or Surface Pro 6 in some scenarios. So pretty cool. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into the throttling characteristics of the Surface Go, and I'll probably do another video on the Surface Go just from a general perspective, how I feel it compares to the general Surface Pros. Thanks for watching. Sorry this went long, but you guys who are subscribed to this channel, you know that I just kind of love exploring these devices and seeing what they're capable of doing. So anyways, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you soon.